Welcome everyone to today's MOCO. So our speaker, Leslie Kaelbing, is a professor of computer science and engineering at MIT, working on making robots more intelligent. So her work covers a wide range of topics, including planning, hierarchical learning, and algorithms for partially observable environments. And in addition to doing foundational work in reinforcement learning, she championed new models of academic publishing as well by funding the Journal of Machine Learning Research. So we are definitely very excited to hear today's talk, and the stage is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I'm not there, but I will. Okay.
Sorry, and everyone, please feel free to ask questions at any time. I try to keep an eye on the chat, but please just speak up if you have a question.
Yes, that's right. I love questions and comments, and I will try to induce some in you as we go. And definitely don't hesitate to speak, but I also won't have my eyes on the chat, so you will have to say something to me. Okay, so I don't know, this title is kind of arrogant for someone talking to the Institute of Biological Cybernetics, because I don't actually know anything about biology, as will become clear, but I'm interested. My goal is to make a generally intelligent robot, and I would like to think of a robot that could solve a wide variety of problems, as broad a wide variety of problems as you can. And one example that I think brings this home is actually a homework assignment I gave students in a seminar, which was to make tea in somebody else's house without asking any questions. Okay, so what would a robot have to know and be able to do to go to your house, or really to any house, let's say any house in the world where they put leaves in hot water and make something to drink? What would you have to know to do that, right? You have to understand some physical stuff, you understand some cultural stuff. It's very complicated. So I would like to make a robot that could do that. So how should we think about the problem? So I should say I'm coming at this problem from the perspective of an engineer. I just kind of want to make a robot that can do this thing. But how can we frame the question? Because I think that sometimes we get into technical arguments because our framing is not careful. So I'm going to try to do this a little bit carefully. And I want to say that my job, I see my job as an engineer, as a job that's kind of analogous to evolutionist's job, which is to make a brain of some sort that is going to go out into the world. And so I'm sitting in my factory and I have to make these robots, and in my robots, I'm going to put a computer program. I'm not going to worry for now about hardware. I'm just going to think about the computer program, the policy that goes in my robot's head. And that policy is a mapping from its history of actions and observations that it's had so far into the next action. And that makes almost no commitment. That's just basically how we think of a control system as behaving. So, okay, so here I am in the factory. I have to put some program in the head of my robots. What program should I put in my robot's head? And the way I want to think about that is to say that I have some probability distribution over worlds that my robot is going to have to go work in. So maybe it's going to have to make tea in somebody's kitchen, but I'm not sure which kitchen, right? And so what I want to think about is finding the program, the policy, the initial sort of brain state of my robot, such that it will maximize in expectation over all the possible worlds that this robot might actually have to find itself in, maximize the kind of reward that it gets. So what's good about this framing, I think, is that it would keep us from having to argue, for instance, about whether this thing should be doing learning or not, or whether it should be symbolic or not. Because at least from a kind of a computational perspective, there just is, there kind of is maybe an optimal strategy in expectation over possible worlds this robot would have to work in. So in a way, that's nice. It's kind of gratifying at the mathematical level, because you say, all right, well, here, there is a way to write down implicitly a solution to the problem that I have. But now my problem as the engineer is that it is very, very difficult. Even if I did have a specification of the distribution of houses that my robot needed to work in, I, as the engineer, have no good way of figuring out what the policy is that I should put into the robot. So that's kind of what I'm going to think about. But let me just stop for a minute and be sure that the framing is okay.
Just one quick question. So you said reward function need not be additive. You wrote down an additive one, right?
I did, right, just to be kind of conventional. I wrote down an additive one, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going, but feel free to poke. All right, so now I want to think about the ways that we approach this problem in terms of some properties, just kind of informal properties of this distribution over domains. And so one kind of axis of thinking about this is in something that's related to like the complexity of the policy that we're going to have to make, or the variability in the class of problems that this robot is going to have to solve, right? So over here on the left, you might imagine a kind of very specific task, and over here on the right, you might imagine a very general purpose kind of robot. And another axis that I think is important is how much the engineers know about the niche that this robot is going to find itself in, right? So down here in the bottom, it's a case where I'm the engineer and I know exactly what the world is going to be like that my robot's going into. And up here's the case where it's the robot who's doing the learning, right? Or who has to gather information, where the engineer really has substantial uncertainty about what's going on. So we can kind of think about, I'm going to go through this a little bit in a little bit more detail in a minute. So we're going to have to figure out how to pick a good policy. And the things that we have to think about are both costs of constructing the policy and costs of actually executing it in the world, right? So the offline, for us, human cost of constructing a policy involves how hard the humans have to think, building simulators, gathering data, labeling stuff, and so on. And then there's work that the machine has to do to help come up with a policy. Maybe offline, it has to do some optimization and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this offline process. So let's just go. All right. So down in the bottom left corner of these axes is what I would take to be classical engineering, that the engineer knows everything about the problem. The problem is relatively narrow. We're really good at this. Atlas can do parkour, so that's nice. What's interesting, and I think a little surprising, is maybe that actually I would argue that almost all the work, at least in robotics and much of AI, that gets called reinforcement learning is used down in this bottom left-hand corner. It's used in the case where we have a relatively narrow thing to do, right? Like manipulate something in our hand or a very kind of specific job. And also in a case where the engineers know exactly or pretty precisely what the domain is going to be like. And that's a little weird, right? So I kind of want to amplify this a little bit. So this is a case of using reinforcement learning methods, which, as you folks absolutely very well know, were kind of, I think, originally intended as a model of learning in an individual who would, take actions and receive rewards and make percepts and so on. And now it's mostly used in a mode which I would call the factory. Okay, so what is reinforcement learning right now mostly used for? It's mostly used in a simulation, right? So here I'm in a situation where I'm the engineer and I know a lot about the domain. I know so much about the domain that I could build a really good simulator for it, which really means that I know almost everything about the domain. But I am not a good compiler. I am not good at taking the simulator and figuring out the best way of behaving. As engineer, I'm bad at that. We're all bad at that. But what I do then instead is I take a reinforcement learning algorithm and I hook it up to the simulator. And it acts like a compiler. It says, okay, I will take that simulator you gave me and I will produce a policy or a value function or something like that. And that is what's going to get executed in the world. So this, I think, is what most current reinforcement learning, the way people are using it. And it's important to recognize that, I think, because it changes understanding, accepting the fact that what we're doing is a kind of compilation with reinforcement learning, which I think is fine. Like there's many problems for which this is the only approach we know. But it means that we should evaluate it in a way that's, I think, not the way that people are usually evaluating. So for instance, if my reinforcement learning algorithm is a compiler, it makes no difference how much reward it gets while it's learning, like not any. There's no notion of reward really during learning, except for, that doesn't really exist. It doesn't matter how many interactions we have with the simulator. We can reset as much as we want to. We should allow ourselves to not force ourselves to follow trajectories through the world necessarily. We should be able to reset the simulator to some state and try all the actions 73 times. That would also be fine. So if we have a simulator in our hands and we accept that, then maybe we can actually use it even more effectively than we're currently using it. I just want to, anyway, encourage people, if they're doing reinforcement learning, what I like to call reinforcement learning in the factory or offline reinforcement learning, to really just think of it as a compiler and to think of the way that we want to evaluate it is in terms of the value of the policy that pops out as a function of how long we've been computing, but to not think about how well it performs while it's going.
I sort of agree with this. On the little caveat is the number of interactions in the simulator does matter if computation time is your x-axis. Right?
It might or it might not. So for instance, a lot of people do a lot of stuff with the replay buffer, which does not incur more interactions with the simulator, but does incur more computation time. So I just want to say that you should just add up your computation time however you spend it.
Right, that's true.
So I got in a little argument with Demis Hassabis about this because I said, well, it doesn't AlphaGo, it doesn't matter if it wins or loses while it's learning. And I mean, because I think it doesn't, right? I think that, of course, it matters that it's learning to play better over time, but exactly the dynamics of how that goes might not matter so much.
That's true. I must say that MCTS, the same is true for MCTS, right? But it's been very hard to get to replace UCT with something which actually doesn't care about reward as you're doing the MCTS, right? So people have tried, we've tried, Stuart's tried, and hasn't.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we've tried hard enough to relax that idea, because I think it's romantic to think of it as actually wanting to win while it's learning, and maybe that's not important. Anyway, okay, so there we go.
Sorry, but isn't the notion of like computation time architecture dependent? So
yeah, so I mean, I'm approaching this in the most pragmatic possible way, just saying I'm an engineer who needs to make a policy to solve this problem, and whatever computer you give me, I should try to use it to the best I can. And you're completely right that depending on the architecture of the computer or whatever, then and maybe it shouldn't be computation time, right? So really maybe my x-axis here should just be money or resource or just some abstract quantity. Yeah.
I see.
I have also a quick question.
Yeah.
So when we work with simulation, why does the computation time matter at all?
Because I'm arguing that that's in fact the only thing that matters. That when you're running in a simulator, it's this whole package, not the runtime of the reinforcement learning algorithm itself. It's the cost of running the simulator and the RL and this whole thing, right? So I'm just gonna, I say I need a controller for my robot, and I want to make this controller for my robot as efficiently as I can do it. And here's a way to do it, which is for me to build a simulator and then to run a reinforcement learning algorithm. But in that case, we should just evaluate like how much time the whole thing takes.
But if the idea is that first we design a policy and then we execute it in the real world, then it's just, a matter of, I don't know, a couple of minutes or a couple of hours more. But at the end, we don't want to generate this in real time mostly, right? So why does it matter? If it was on the real world, I could see, okay, this matters a lot. But since we are doing in simulation, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right. In a sense, it clearly doesn't matter nearly as much as it would online. But there's still the question of whether it takes me one CPU week or a month or a year to find my strategy. I mean, I still have to care about resources over here to some degree.
So my main point is that, okay, the idea is that at some point we will do all this reinforcement learning in the real world, or we always want to keep a world model like a simulation. This is why basically I'm asking this. We want to make it super efficient such that we can do it in the real world, or no, it doesn't matter. At the end, we will have the simulation. Simulation is essential for our case. And we just want to see, I don't know, how much time it requires to generate this policy.
I will say, try to clarify one more time, and then we can talk more later, maybe. But I think that, so reinforcement learning has two really different and useful roles to play in our whole enterprise. And I've only talked about one, and the one that I'm talking about right now is the offline role. and for me, the offline role in simulation is an analog maybe of evolution, right? It's stuff that happens before the agent is in the world. That's it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to charge ahead. All right. So, okay, so so far, I would say mostly these methods have been good for problems where what the robot has to do is reasonably narrow, a specific task that we can really tune up a policy for. I am personally most interested in this other sort of end of the spectrum where you have a kind of very general purpose robot. Maybe it's not nearly as good at any individual thing like you and me, but it is pretty okay at a whole lot of things. And so how can we kind of think about that regime? And I would say that, you know, for a long time, I worked on designing a kind of an architecture for very general purpose robot. And I've just talked to you about that just a little bit. And we're going to work our way up to that by thinking about ways of representing a policy. Okay, so because in the end, we need a policy. That's clear. In the end, that's what we need. And clearly one way to represent a policy. And when I think about ways to represent a policy, I think again, like, of course, these have computational impact, but it's also useful to think about again as a designer, because if I'm going to build this thing, I personally as an engineer might need to think about some structure. But okay. So one way to represent a policy is to just straight up learn a policy, just this mapping from histories into actions. It can be very hard to search for these computationally, so maybe that's not always the right strategy. We're used to a bunch of other strategies, right? Another one is to represent a value function. And then the policy involves taking an argmax over the actions at every step. That's not always easy though, because maybe you have to max over the actions. Another thing is that the notion of a value function depends usually on dynamic programming being good for you, right? That's why it's sometimes efficient to learn or write down the cube function, but in many problems that might not really be true. Another way of representing a policy is to put deliberation in the head of the agent, right? So we could say, no, I am not going to represent the policy directly, or even a value function. I'm going to represent some kind of transition model. And maybe I could use an approximate policy or an approximate value function as a kind of search guidance, as a way of speeding up the process. I can have some mixture of these things. So maybe I'm going to represent a policy by using a planner. That's fine. It's still a policy if you back up and draw the box around it. It's just that it's thinking online. And then maybe I want to do something a little more hierarchical, right? Maybe the granularity at which I want to plan is not the same as the granularity at which I want to have control. So maybe I want to have some low-level controllers. Maybe also it's useful to interpose a module that can kind of interpret the sensory signals over time and deliver some kind of a more abstract representation of the state, right? So that's another thing that might be helpful. And finally, we find it helpful also to maybe do this planning and execution at multiple levels of hierarchy. And I could talk about that, but I'm probably not going to get into detail. So, okay, so imagine that we adopt some kind of architecture a little bit like this. We can build in algorithms, right? So we can say, all right, I am, just as we build in convolution into a convolutional neural network, I could build in some more perception algorithms, maybe some kind of recursive state estimation of some sort, some kind of forward search, some kind of ability to construct abstractions and so on. And if I build in those algorithms, then it's these models that I need in order to actually fully instantiate an agent. And so I just to illustrate a robot, actually, I'm just going to go to the thing here. I'm going to show you a robot doing some stuff. And what's interesting about this is that any individual thing this robot does, some good students in a couple of weeks could have hacked up, but it's the same code doing all these things, right? So this gets a little bit to my point about generality. And is it precisely the same code? No, but it's close enough. Okay, so here's a problem where we told this robot to put the blue box where the soup can is. And this robot reasons about space. It has it understands its own kind of uncertainty about things. It reasons about looking and visibility. It understands rigid objects and picking them up and putting them down. Oops, okay. So it says, all right, I have to move the soup can out of the way to put the blue box down there where that goes. Here's one where we told it to put the green box over on the corner of the table. The green box is too big to pick up. So it figures out it has to push the green box, but in order to push the green box, it has to get the orange one out of the way. So it gets the orange one out of the way. I thought it was going to put the orange one back down, but it actually just holds on to it with its other hand because it figures it doesn't need to. It knows its pushing is pretty unreliable, so it looks to see where it's gone and it repeats, it pushes again. None of this is programmed in directly, right? This is all planning. This is all, I give it a goal, it can do perception and it reasons about what it needs to do. In this case, we asked it to move out of the lab. I should say it knows about the object models. It can only, in this case, interact with objects with models that it knows very accurately. So it's kind of very specific in that case. But here we asked it to go out of the lab. It looked at, saw these chairs were in the way. It moved one chair out of the way. The other chair it grabbed a hold of, and again, like with the orange box, it just brought it with it. Okay, so there's more, but you get the basic idea. The big thing that's not so good about this is that there was no learning at all in here. This is just kind of, I think, pretty nice reasoning mechanisms, but totally hand-built models. And it's very, tied to doing the things that working with the objects that it knows about and so. So that's an argument here. All right, so let's talk about learning now then. So what happens when the engineer, in fact, doesn't know so much about the environment that the robot's going to have to work in, right? So I would argue that when the engineer or nature or whoever it is who's building this policy that goes in the individual doesn't know so much about the world of the agent, then that's when we need to have learning actually in the individual. And so I would say this is what reinforcement learning was maybe kind of originally intended for, and it's usually applied in cases where, again, it's a fairly narrow task that we have to do. Someone drew this cartoon for me and I have always liked it, right? The reinforcement learning has its uses in the wild, but probably like learning physics in your kitchen is not one of them, right? So that's not what we would like. And I would argue again that we are not evaluating our RL in the wild algorithms in the way that we should. Most of us, some are. I think when you're doing reinforcement learning in the wild now, it's exactly the opposite of what I suggested before. Before I suggested that the reward during learning made no difference whatsoever. Now, if you're actually learning in the agent in the world, then every single thing you break or spill should cost you. And so you really want to be integrating your reward over your whole lifetime, starting from the very first models. So this is, I think, just another regime of applying reinforcement learning, but we should be careful which regime we're in. Okay, so now I want to talk about, and this has been a long preamble, but it's probably more fun anyway, the work that we kind of are doing now, which is attempting to take kind of some of the architectural lessons from having built this thing kind of by hand and backing out of that and learning some of the pieces and parts that could kind of build the whole agent. And so I'm going to take you on a quick tour of some examples of this in the research that we're doing in our group. So let's talk about perception. I know lots of you are perception type people, Heinrich. So we decided, actually based on a lot of people complaining about all this task and motion planning work that we do, that it's completely useless because it needs perfect models. And what could you possibly do if you didn't have perfect models? We said, okay, well, what can we do if we have no models? So this is MOM, manipulation with 0 models. And it was an exercise that took a moderately extreme position, which is to say, let's assume that we still believe in objects, like we believe in physical objects in the world. And we know the robot's kinematics, and we know a kind of multimodal planning notion for picking up and putting down objects. but we don't know anything about the particular objects that we're going to see. So we're going to try to use some pre-trained perception modules. The worst possible thing, and I would love to talk to some of you folks about this maybe later in the question and answers or something, but the segmentation algorithms are still terrible, I have to say. Class agnostic segmentation does not work very well. We use some neural networks that would try to predict what would be a good place to grasp an object based on the point cloud, some notion of shape completion, and some category detection stuff just so that you could name objects. So the idea here is that we would, if we had some perception modules that could detect useful affordances or useful things that we could do to these objects in the world and make some, also predict, for instance, where you could set an object down in a way that would be stable, then the question is, could we just use that and still use our planning strategy and end up with, a kind of a good robot? And so again, it's a policy, right? This whole gray box is a policy. It takes in RGBD images. It runs these neural networks to estimate some properties of what's going on in the world and to do segmentation. It takes in a goal written in logic, kind of a logical formula as a goal. That could be natural language, but right now it's just it's logic. We put it into the planner makes a plan, we execute the first step, and then we see what happened and so on. Now, this is not the best version of this that we know in principle how to do. It's just the first thing we did. So for instance, it doesn't have any memory, and I can tell you some places where that's a problem, and that's a thing we're working on now. But let's watch it do some stuff because it's kind of fun. So here's one. Ooh, let's get Kaelin out of the way. Okay, so we just put these objects on the table. It doesn't know models of these objects. It has just this one viewpoint. So from here, the small objects are occluded. It's been given the goal of putting all the objects on the mat. And so it only sees the Cheez-It box. So it makes a plan to put it there. And then it looks and it says, oh, snap, there are all these other objects. So then it has to move the Cheez-It box out of the way, pick up these things. And then so it uses its planning and reasoning to do the right geometric thing and be sure that it can make space for the box, and then it puts the box back. Oh, that was not what I wanted to do.
Okay. So you could just have moved the box on the mat. You didn't have to move it off the mat altogether, right?
Actually, no, because I don't think it could have reached to put the small one down behind it. I think kinematically it might have been tricky.
Could you have pushed the mat?
It does not have, okay, good. So it does not have that in its repertoire. I mean, it has currently what it knows how to do in a certain sense, what the planning algorithm knows how to do is pick and place. So it couldn't have pushed the mat in this case. But right, I mean, there's all kinds of things that conceivably it could have done, and you would like it to be able to learn to do these other things and so on. But yeah, no, this is just.
So what exactly is learned in this scenario? So the word model sort of is fixed. So it does see an image, and it gets basically a list of objects on the image together with positions, if I understand correctly.
Right. What's being learned? There's no policy learning. In this case, the only learning was offline, and it was learning the segmentation and the recognizing properties of objects, like where you might grasp it or where you might sit it down.
Yes, but yeah, so once you had the algorithm that you showed before that moved around the chairs, then basically all the remaining difficulty is in the segmentation model. Is that correct?
Well, all the remaining difficulty, that's a very strong statement, but our worst problem is in the perception. I mean, so the question is, how do you see the world and divide it into things? And really the best segmentation method that we used was not any of the neural networks, but just something that did kind of point cloud segmentation. Just yeah, a hand-built method was better than the neural networks for almost every one of these subtasks, actually. But I guess the point here is that you can have weak perception. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have perfect models of the objects, and you can still do stuff.
Yeah, but in order to get that perceptual model, do you need to have like something like a label data set, or is it an unsupervisedly learned segmentation?
The ones we used, the models we used were were pre-trained by other people.
Okay, but did they use labels or just?
They used, I'm sure they were trained, I think, mostly in simulation using ground truth segmentation.
Okay,
yeah.
I see.
No, it feels
But
very
if
much
any of you could give me better algorithms for any part of this perceptual pipeline, I would use them tomorrow.
But I think Mishi's point is that then sounds very much like at the bottom of your axis. You've put it halfway up your axis, but it seems like you've fed in most of the learning ahead of time using by engineering. You've borrowed somebody else's algorithms for these and so forth.
Yes, you're right. You're right. It's not learning online yet. This thing is not learning online. That's a good point. I have an ambition. Well, I'm never going to get there, but I do have an ambition that I can tell you about learning online. And we're starting to work on this. But yes. Okay. So this was right, offline learning. What's good is though we get like, zero shot generalization or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Here we told it to put every fruit in the bowl of a similar color. It hasn't seen these fruits. It doesn't know they're fruits, but it's able to kind of do the thing. So this is just meant to be an illustration that some of the planning type stuff can work even when the models aren't perfect. I also like this one. It turns out that segmentation on that was really hard. And obviously it had never seen this object before. It will persist until it puts all the bits on the blue map. Okay. Oh. And it runs on another robot and so on. Okay. So okay. So what else could we learn? And so another thing, so this is now thinking about a kind of online learning, which is not the kind of online learning the bees do, but maybe the kind of online learning that a 10-year-old does. So imagine that you have a competent robot. It already knows how to pick things up and put them down. It knows it's on kinematics. It can do reasonably good perception, but you want to teach it something new, right? Like I like to use beating eggs as an example of a thing you could teach a 10-year-old, although not my robot, right? And so how would that go? So I would say, lots of people are working on getting robots to learn a new skill. And I am here not going to focus on the RL part of learning the new policy, right? So for beating eggs, I think there is a little kind of RL localized, maybe classical RL-ish thing that you might do online to learn to beat the eggs. But it's pretty localized. The thing I'm going to focus on is imagine that you've learned the little egg beating policy. How do you add that to your repertoire? Right? Because usually people stop at the egg beating policy. But I have to know what are the preconditions. I have to have a bowl and it has to be a certain size and there have to be eggs in it and I have to be holding the whisk with a certain kind of grasp and so on. And these are all preconditions. And so how can I understand that, right? So here's an example of an abstract model of a task, which we call an operator description, doesn't really matter. I should say abstract model of a skill. And so we need to think about conditions on the situation in which we launch that policy. So imagine I have a policy for beating eggs, or in this case for pouring. It's a little program, and I'm going to call it at some point. Question is, when should I call it and with what parameters so that it will have the result that I'm hoping for? And so one way to think about it is that there are some continuous parameters, like maybe a grasp and the width and height of the vessels that I'm pouring into and out of, and a relative position of these objects. And there's some constraint, some relation on all these continuous values, such that if this relation holds and I call my pouring program, the stuff will end up where I want it to go. And so that's what I want to learn, right? So I'm going to say, all right, I've learned some basic egg beating policy, and now I'm interested in understanding how to apply it. And let me just check my timer. Okay, so I'm gonna, you guys have all heard enough about Gaussian processes. I'm not gonna talk about this in general, but fundamentally we can just formulate this as a problem that takes a tuple of the parameters describing the situation in which I applied this policy and how well it worked out. And I'm gonna try to learn this mapping, so a kind of scoring function. I think some people might call this an energy-based model these days, but it doesn't really matter. Anyway, it's a mapping from some stuff to how well it works. And we did train this on a real robot, although we didn't train it, what's the right word? I don't know, ecologically or something, right? So the training happened kind of in an offline way, but we used the planner to actually, so this is a GP is picking which experiments to do, and we were doing them, and we had to pick up a whole heck of a lot of chickpeas in the process, and so we really did also care about not doing too many experiments. So right, so you know, active experimentation was important for us. Also important to us, I mean, the reason that we're learning the scoring function is because we don't want to learn just one way of scooping or pouring, right? Because later on, when we try to apply this skill in context, it might be that we're inhibited from pouring this way because there's something in the way, or I can't quite reach, and I need to pour that way, or I need to do something in a slightly unusual way. So it's actually important to us to kind of learn, if we can, a locus of feasible ways of executing the skill so that we can combine it flexibly with other things and other constraints when we're reasoning later. And so after we do that, so this is just kind of another demonstration. Here's a case where we learned the pouring pre-images and we learned pushing here. And so again, with a reasonably general purpose planner, we can tell it what we want just as a high level goal. Here it's supposed to serve some stuff on that tray. So it knows to put the bowl, it figured out to put the bowl on the tray, it moved the green thing out of the way, it picked up the cup, and it came over and it pours the stuff. I let it do 2 more of these examples. I think the next one is kind of nice. Okay, so then next one, you'll see the bowl is over on the side, and it reasons again on its own that it needs to push the bowl into the middle of its workspace because it wouldn't have been able to reach all the way over to pour. So by using a smart planner in combination with and learning the models that the planner can use, we end up again with very kind of more general and flexible kind of behavior.
So this one learned first how to pour, and then learned how to which the like reasonable preconditions are based on the fixed like sort of action abstraction of pouring.
Yes.
You could do it the other way around as well, right? So you could learn what does it mean to pour.
Yes, I mean, that's a super interesting chicken and egg kind of problem, right? I mean, I think the way it probably ought to go, what we really want to do is make this robot so that you could instruct it, right? So that there's the robot and we say, okay, robot, I'm interested in getting, you know, in getting this stuff in this cup or something. And first it should learn some perceptual predicates so that it can recognize the condition. Like if I were teaching you to beat eggs, I would first teach you what does it look like when you, what soft peaks is this term that cooks use when the eggs are beaten a certain amount. I would teach you what soft peaks looks like. And I would say, okay, that's what we're trying to achieve. So now you have a reward function for a local policy. And then you could learn a policy, maybe motor skill policy, just for doing that, maybe in this one bowl. Okay, so that's good. So now you know how to beat eggs in this one bowl. And you know you need to be holding the whisk in this one way because I showed you how to hold the whisk or something. So that's like one example of what this guy, so you'd have the policy, you'd have the objective for the policy, and you would have one example of a situation in which it worked out. Then you would try beating eggs in some other situations, different bowls, different whisks, and you would learn more about the preconditions. You would learn more about this thing that I just showed you about what are the conditions that are necessary. So that if you came to my house and you needed to find a bowl to beat eggs in, you would know what kind of bowl to try. That's maybe idea.
Yeah, definitely. It's just you could also learn like different like adapt your ways of moving.
Yeah, no, of course. And I don't imagine that it's really this rigid, that of course you would improve your egg beating skills over time too. Or you might learn that if the bowl is shallow, you need a lower gain than if the bowl is very deep or something, right? And I think clearly this stuff should somehow all keep going over a long, long, long time horizon, which we all don't have any idea how to do, really. Okay. another thing that we've been thinking about lately is really learning abstraction strategies. And so again, I'm talking about pieces of work that notionally fit in, but they're not all part of a one system yet. They're part of a way of thinking, but not all. And so another thing I've been thinking about is how do you actually derive the abstractions that are helpful, right? So we have another kind of planning strategy that uses a symbolic model for planning at the high level and a kind of continuous stuff at the lower level. And it's able to kind of invent its own predicates. So we start with some very low level kind of representation space, and we assume that we have a transition model down at the low level. And the idea is a set of predicates is just basically a set of tests, of classifiers on the low level state representation. If you have this set of classifiers of properties and relations on objects, if you have this, then you can construct an abstracted representation, usually in some kind of relational representation in the blue. We then learn a transition model on the blue level of abstraction, and samplers, which effectively take an abstract action, right? An abstract action might be like pour stuff into a cup, and the samplers are in charge of picking the parameters with which we do the pouring. And so that gives us pieces that we need to do a kind of bi-level planning strategy. And so now the question is, well, can we learn all these things at once? And so some students in our group have been working on that. And it's a combination of like really old school learning, like kind of inductive logic programming at the symbolic level, and kind of neural network stuff at the interface between the symbolic and the continuous level, and it learns efficiently and so on. What is interesting about this? So one thing that's important is that I think the only planning method that I know of that can really work on long horizons is this kind of AI classical planning, abstracted symbolic stuff, because it has a natural built-in domain independent heuristic that's useful. So we can plan for quite long horizons in pretty complicated problems. And what's also kind of interesting is that is to look at the predicates that get invented in a sense by this learning method. So if you give it like, oh, blocks world, then it recovers the predicates that we usually teach in AI class for describing planning in the blocks world. Although interestingly, if you change the method that the planner is using, you actually get slightly different formalizations, right? So it learns a way of thinking about the world that makes its algorithm run efficiently, which is kind of interesting.
Sorry, just to clarify, are predicates like longer scale actions, or what do you mean by predicates exactly?
A predicate is a classifier. So like if you were taking old school AI and you were describing a problem, you might, there might be an on predicate, right? So that's like, it's a relationship between two objects, or is cooked, or is in the oven or something. So it's just a classifier. It's just a Boolean property of an object or a relationship between objects. And it gives you a way of thinking about a problem that's down in the low level continuous state. It gives you a discrete low dimensional abstraction of the state if you apply these predicates to all the objects in your world.
Great, thanks.
So one thing that's interesting is that now if we apply it to some other problems, like, so we have some domain that involves painting objects, and it invents predicates that we would never have thought of. Like, it turns out that it ends up with a much more efficient theory at the abstract level for planning, which includes a predicate like, is this the only box of its color? So we're now learning abstract stuff that's better than what the engineers could have written now. All right, I'm going to fly through a couple more ideas just so that we can stop and talk. So what did I talk about? So I've talked really about learning transition models in a way. So models that the planner can use to do its business. Of course, we all know that search control is really important too, right? That's the principle of learning Q functions to help MCTS and that kind of thing. The question is, in the domains that we care about in the robotics context, it's hard to even represent a state, right? It's it's popular to try to, let's see. There's a lot of people who are working on learning in robotics type problems who make sure that the robot is looking straight down at a table, and so that the entire state is revealed in a single image, in which case you can use an image as a representation of the state. If your problem is more complicated, you can't use a single image as a representation of your state. You have to aggregate information from multiple viewpoints. You might have to reason about what's going on in a room you can't see, and so on. And so then it's actually hard to even think about what is a good state representation. So we tend to use, representations in terms of a set of objects and their relationships or their geometric poses in the world or something like that. So then the question is, if we have such a representation of our domain, which is complicated, it doesn't have a fixed dimensionality, and where our actions are also complicated, like I might need to push an object that's there's a discrete parameter might be which object I'm going to push, and the continuous parameters might be in what direction or for how far. So my action space is this weird hybrid space also. And so one way to think about that is to do an MCTS-like search. I think this is not great for long horizons, but it's interesting to think about. And one way to think about it is that we might alternate between picking discrete and continuous parameters. But one question is, how could we learn some kind of search control? How could we learn something to help us decide what to do next? And so we're also interested in getting pretty aggressive generalization. So here we have this case where we have this robot and it's like an apartment, and it needs to, let's say it needs to move the red object into the other room, or maybe it needs to move all the boxes into the other room. And in our dreams, right, what we set out to do here was to say, well, all right, if we learned how to manipulate objects in the big apartment, could we use that same geometric reasoning at some level to manipulate the objects that are inside these shelves? The fundamental geometric relationships seem similar, although what it looks like is completely different. And so we had some success doing this by trying to learn a Q function at the abstract level first, and doing that with, let's see, okay, basically a graph neural network, again, where the graph neural network was given input at a somewhat abstract level. So these abstractions were designed by clever humans, my students. And so the graph neural network the input to the GNN was relations and predicates like, is this object reachable right now? Or is this object, does it occlude, right? So is in this case, like the red object occludes the robot from reaching the green one, right? So we made a graph neural network that had this information in it, which was computed from, by using it, you have to use a planner actually to compute these features. But given features like that, then it could learn to generalize pretty well. And it learned to actually search much more efficiently and so on.
Do the number of nodes in the graph relate to the objects? And
Yeah.
if so, then how does this work when changing the number of objects in the environment?
Well, in fact, that's the best feature of graph neural networks, right? Is that they are agnostic about how many nodes you have, right? I mean, you learn the kernels in the GNN, and then you can apply it to any number of objects.
Okay, so you learn something which then you can just like do to as many, what you learn applies to more than just one graph structuring.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, no, that's like the cool thing. Yeah. Okay, so
your actions come into the picture as edges in the graph as well, or
no, that we just use the graph to predict a Q function.
okay.
Yeah.
So all right. So each action is just a node value. The Q value of each action is
the Q value of each action, of basically manipulating each object.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to do one more idea in lightning speed and then stop. So, okay. So now what if you have a really big problem, like a really, really big problem? Long horizon, huge action space, tons of objects. You live in the world is very complicated. How could you possibly do what you do? Okay, so I'm going to say we solve huge problems and we have small brains. So how can we make that work out? And the usual thing that people talk about is scaling up their algorithm to solve bigger problems, but I don't want to do that. I want to scale the problem down to fit in my head. And I want to think about this as in terms of like me going through the world, always abstracting this big old hairy problem that I have to solve into something that I can do. And so the idea is that I need a metacognitive strategy. I need some kind of policy now that takes something about my whole big problem and maps it into an abstract problem that I can solve right now in the time and space I have available. And I can use the answer of that either to formulate my next abstract planning problem or to pick an action. And so I'll just fly through some examples of this. So one example is learning what objects are relevant, right? Like for some reason, I'm looking at Peter's image right now, and there's a whole lot of objects in his office, and most of them are not relevant to his eating breakfast or having this conversation. So how do you think about that? Right? How could you make an abstraction of your current domain that ignores almost all the objects? So we worked on, again, using a graph neural network, training a graph neural network, given an initial state of a problem and a goal, to predict scores on the objects, how likely we think that they are to be relevant to this solving this problem. And that lets us build an abstract model with just a few most relevant objects, construct a plan in that abstract model. We can test the plan back out in the whole big model to see if we left out too many details or not. And if we did, we can add more objects back in. So that's one idea. Another idea comes from temporal hierarchy. So there's a kind of a way of constructing a temporal hierarchy is to postpone consideration of the factors that are easiest to change, right? So for instance, when I'm traveling, I might worry about, I mean, I've learned, for instance, recently, I don't know, in the last 20 years, I don't worry about money anymore when I'm traveling, in the sense that I'm pretty sure that when I get there, I can stick my card in an ATM and get money out. Right. So I can, even though I know that if I'm traveling to another country, I might need money, I can plan my travel without the money part of it, impinging on my high level travel. Now, once I get to the airport and I need to get a taxi, I might need to suddenly, okay, now I'm in a lower level of abstraction. The horizon is shorter. I need to get myself to the hotel. Now I could have to worry about the money and where do I find the taxis? And then I can go down more and more levels of abstraction. So that's another principle for constructing smaller problems. Another one is to adopt constraints on your actions. So you might say, I'm pretty sure I can solve this problem without going outside my building. So let me not worry about going outside my building. Or I'm pretty sure I can solve this problem without buying new clothes or without, I don't know, all these things. So can you reduce your action space? So in terms of like the long, long horizon, this is where I hope eventually to go. And I see a question and I'm just going to say that, I don't know, maybe we get human. So I'll take your question, Turan, when I'm done. I'm just finishing up. Maybe we get human-like generalization from learning world models that are combinatorial and efficiently reusable using architectural constraints. And I would thank a bunch of my students, and you can watch the robot flail just a little bit, and I am happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much for the great talk. And yeah, maybe Turan should start then.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Can we go back a few slides with the graph neural network and then the objects? The next one. No.
Oh, the predicting which objects.
Yes. So here, the objects are predetermined, and we know what they are, or like how do we know like which objects do we have even in the environment to determine which are the important ones? And
yeah. So I have completely bought into, I've talked to Josh Tenenbaum all the time, and he says, Liz Belke says that, you know, I don't know, mammals have the notion of object built in. So I'm just assuming that we can learn to understand the world around us in terms of objects. Now, I know that there are questions about levels of abstraction, like is it one grape or a bunch of grapes? And that's going to be a choice, I think, kind of like the one that I'm making here. But that I'm going to just assume that I have the perceptual ability to do some kind of segmentation. It could be wrong, it could be ambiguous, that's okay. But I cannot escape from personally thinking about the world in terms of objects, and that's just how I'm rolling. I understand that that's not a view that most people have. Okay. Now, in this work, however, what's important is each individual problem, we can train the graph neural network on a bunch of different scenes, if you will, a bunch of different situations with this one has 2 objects and that one has 73. There's different numbers of objects. They have different properties and relations in every single training example. So that when we go to apply this to a new problem, we look at the world, we see what objects we have, that we instantiate the graph neural network given the objects that we have and their perceived properties and relations. And then it predicts which ones are relevant.
okay, so I guess like then we'll have like some upper bound to the number of objects we can track, given the segmentation.
No upper bound is necessary. So this is the super cool thing about graph neural networks, which is they're, in a way, it's like, it's a kind of convolutional network, right? So it's clear that if you have a convnet and you've learned the kernels in the convolutional layers, you could make a bigger image and still apply those same convolutions and everything would be cool. And in a graph neural network, it's a similar sort of thing. You learn little convolutional things, little local modules. And then however big the domain is that you are presented with, you can make a graph for that domain using the same learned network.
I see. Okay, it's basically like you focus on some part of the scene attention, kind of, right? Because to use this graph, because the trained graph is like fixed, right?
No. This is the cool. No, graph. Go read about graph neural networks. So no, the trained graph is not fixed. What is fixed, what is learned, is so basically you can think about message passing on a graph, right? So if I made a graph, you could say, okay, here's my graph, and I have some input, which is input on the labels and the nodes. And my neural network is a module that takes information from my neighbors and aggregates it in some way and takes my local properties and computes some latent thing and passes it on to my neighbors. And that little computation can be done in a graph of any connectivity and any size.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Sure.
Ervinden?
Thanks for the talk. I mean, my question might be naive, and also you partially addressed it in the previous question. I was curious, I mean, was there a particular motivation that you use the graph neural network rather than other, or like graph neural network is a general solution for your problem, or you try different things and you come to the solution?
No, it's again, it's exactly because my input is best understood as a graph, at least by me, right? So, okay. I don't have an image representation of my domain. There's no single image that will represent the state of the objects in my apartment, right? I have to represent the state of the objects in my apartment. And the way I do that is in terms of, right, you can think of it as a set of objects and their properties and their relationships. And a graph neural network is about, I mean, fundamentally, the only kind of mapping that can accept input that's like that. Because the number of objects is completely variable and the connectivity is variable and so on.
Got it, exactly.
Kevin?
So if I understand correctly on this slide, you don't have to learn the policy, right? There's a fixed planning algorithm that will.
Yeah, so this is meant to be an instance of this kind of general idea of taking a big problem and mapping it into a small one.
Right. So I guess my question is, like, if you have all these different representations that you have to learn, it seems like, I guess if you sort of, if this makes sense, if you kind of stack them together, like learning will become more and more inefficient, right? So if you were perhaps like learning the policy here, having to also figure out, I guess, which objects are relevant, that might sort of, I imagine that might slow down learning of the policy. And then if you have also like sort of hierarchical representations of the learn as well, seems like every piece of the puzzle you kind of add into the problem could kind of makes the problem more and more difficult to solve. Does that kind of make sense? Or
well, let's see. I mean, I think the choices are fundamentally, I guess, I want to be able to solve these like kind of really hairy problems. And in the end, it's just computational stuff between the input and the output, right? With some memory. And you can, it's when you say the policy, so I think people have taken maybe too seriously the notion of policies from reinforcement learning, that a policy should be a kind of a feed forward representation that maps the input to an action without internal structure. Now, it could be that, or at least it could be an RNN, right? Technically speaking, you could train some recurrent model to be a policy if you had enough data and time. But I don't have enough data or time, me personally. So I'm placing my bets in a different way, which is to spend some of my engineering intelligence designing a structure, which I think might be good. And maybe animals have a structure that they're born with that might be like this or not like this or something, I don't know, but they're certainly not uniform bags of goo when they're born, animals. So the question is, what is it that makes them not uniform bags of neural goo? And how does that give them leverage on learning in the world without dying, right? And so I'm trying to think about what's the structure that I could build in and train offline, so that when I put my robot in your house, it can learn the stuff it needs to learn in your house, but it doesn't have to learn its own kinematics and physics and all of that.
Right. And then to speculate a little bit, do you imagine sort of like in the long term, you would have like a library of like different structures you have about the world? Like one of them here is like which objects are relevant for the state and goal. And then you have maybe have another one for like sort of material properties. Is this a liquid? Is this a solid? Do you expect to have just an entire list or library of all these different structures? Or
yeah, I guess maybe that's right. And certainly you'd want the ability to acquire new ones, but you might want to start out with some of them, or at least, yeah. I haven't thought that far ahead, maybe.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I want to get your, hear you talk a little bit about partial observability. So obviously something you've worked on a lot in your past. So you gave us a perceptual module. I think that was the closest we came to real partial observability here. But you're sort of abandoning, it's just too difficult basically. And so now everything has to be, so even in your case where you have the objects behind the box, you sort of remove the box, you take another look, and I find the objects that need to be there.
I have absolutely not abandoned that. In fact, what I spent most of my personal hacking time lately is on that, and we just have a IROS paper on it to do learning in the partially observable case. So I understand how to do reasoning in the partially observable case, I think reasonably well. So, but learning in the partially observable case is super hard, and not very many people are thinking about it. We just have a paper that just got accepted after being rejected, I don't know how many times, which, okay. Which does the following, I know we've all been there, right? It does the following thing. It takes the structure of a data association filter, right? So some of you will know what that is, that people used to do this when tracking radars, blips and so on, where you basically, you have some kind of a module that has hypotheses about entities in the world. And it gets in observations, and it takes observations and the hypotheses it has, and it figures out, oh, this is probably an observation of that, and it updates the estimate and so on. So it's a kind of a classic way of building a belief about the world when you only have observations that are partial and separated and so on. So what we did is we took that structure, but we ripped out all the models and made it differentiable. And so we can train a thing to be a data association filter, which, you know, and that works locally on some small problems, but it's kind of works a little bit. So that's an idea about how to get back. And we're also working on that in the, you know, the context of, you know, you can't even stack objects. It's interesting, right? You can't even make a stack unless you can reason about partial observability. So that robot that was like looking down from above, if you tell it to make a stack of 3 objects, it puts one on the second one, then it looks down and it says, oh, one of the objects disappeared. I don't know what to do, right? So it's clear that you need memory. And we're just struggling, really wrestling right now with how to do that.
Thank you.
So if I may have a question as well. So you first showed examples of like training perception and decision making separately, and then you alluded to like versions in which they could be coupled in certain ways. So what do you think like reasonable objective function is in general for learning the perceptual component of the agents? So do you think like they should be like learned in a reward-based way, or is that like too unimpoverished of a signal to rely on?
That's a really good question. And I think, I mean, so it seems to me that we do need to find well, again, okay, there's the offline part and the online part. And I think we have to keep those separate because I really think they can be separate. And I think in simulation, you have ground truth labels for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can at least get started in simulation with ground truth labels for segmentation and class and material properties and resting faces and graspability and all this stuff. I think then you still want to tune online. That seems clear too. And I think you need a lot of kind of self-supervision and intermodality predictions, you know, the stuff where like predicting 1 step ahead and 4 steps ahead, predicting based on what I feel and what I see, predicting based on like somehow getting a bunch of predictions that should, you know, different ways of arriving at the same information through different reasoning and sensory paths, and they should all agree. So various kinds of kind of internal consistency seems important, and predicting what you're going to sense after you take an action. So I think that there are ways of setting up a bunch of loss, you know, intermediate losses or heads or whatever you want to call them, that would help you make these things consistent. I think the end-to-end is just hopeless, really, for a very, very complicated system. That you need find ways of making internal models be consistent. That doesn't mean though. So for instance, you might say, oh, you know, every time I make a cake, it doesn't work out very well. I mean, I think local end-to-endness, that's not sensible as a concept, but maybe it is. Like, you could do little local end-to-end learning, I think, in a way, right? So you might say, my egg beating procedure is not working very well, and I need to tune up my perceptual properties for the egg beating, but not my life, right? So you have to figure out a way to make it local. I think that's also really important. So being able to be incremental and local in your learning. If I teach you to beat eggs, it does not mess up your ability to do dancing or calculus or whatever else, right? It is just like somehow different.
I see, but for agents who don't have an offline phase like animals, so would it be something like imitation learning that does the first part?
Well, but I think animals do have an offline learning phase, and it's evolution.
Well, yeah, that does like some of it, but
okay.
for humans, for high level tasks.
But imitation is important. So I think, but imitation, I would argue that a lot of the work that's going on right now in robotics in imitation is at the completely wrong level of abstraction, right? So a lot of people are super into like learning trajectories or policies, like control strategies almost from imitation. And I think that that's not sensible. I think what I learned from imitation is that you can do something, what it looks like when it's done, maybe what happens to the objects in the world, right? So something about the process.
Mhm.
And then I have to learn using my own motor abilities to do the thing. I could teach you to solder. Imagine, right? What would you learn if I taught you to solder, right? It would not be imitation in any kind of very classical sense, but it would be imitation in some other sense, right? Because you would know that you had to grab the soldering iron and put the pointy end of it where the solder was and some stuff like that, right? So you would, I think, learn about relations among objects and about the time course of the process. And all those things would be scaffolding that would let you do a tiny bit of reinforcement learning to learn the skill yourself.
I see. Thank you. So anyone else? If not, then let's thank Leslie again for the wonderful talk. And
All right. Thank you, guys. And I'm happy to chat with folks tomorrow. I think I have a busy schedule. And if anybody else wants to talk, we could stick you in or have a joint conversation or something.
Thanks so much, Leslie.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.